Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Prototyping AI Ethics Futures series, co-hosted by the Just AI Project, a Lovelace Institute and the British Academy. Great to have you all join us for this panel today on racial justice. And most importantly, I'm so proud as the director of the Ada Lovelace Institute to introduce the first cohort of the Just AI Fellows, who will be our panelists and speakers today. A few housekeeping issues before we get started. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the Ada Lovelace Institute website later today or tomorrow. If you want access to closed captioning, it's available at the bottom of your screen. Just click on the CC button. You can follow us along this conversation on Twitter. We are at Ada Lovelace Inst, and we're using the hashtag AI Ethics Futures for this event. This is the fourth day of panels, so we're all feeling pretty excited to be constantly talking to interesting people and having interesting conversations this week. We have a final panel again tomorrow, and I'll remind you of that before we close out the conversation. So I'm going to start by introducing our fellows and telling you just a little bit about how this came to be, and then we'll hear from each of the panelists about their research and their expertise. So the Just AI project is a collaboration between the A. Lovelace Institute and the Arts and Humanities Research Council that was set up in late 2019. And we had the ambition of developing a network of academics working on AI ethics issues across a number of disciplines. Professor Alison Powell at the LSE is the director of the network, and she has two excellent postgrad working with her on this project for the last 2 years. The fellowship scheme was a more recent intervention, and it arose and was prompted very much by last summer's resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and our recognition at the Ada Lovelace Institute that we weren't doing enough to support scholarship on issues of racial justice and AI. And so we, with the kind help of AHRC, decided to commission a range of projects and appoint a range of fellows with the view to locating and filling gaps in ethical thinking about data and AI with respect to racial justice. We really conceived this as a space for academic inquiry and an attempt to create a supportive environment for scholars whose work had been underrepresented in academia and in policy. We were so fortunate to have, I think, around 100 applications for the fellowship, and through a pretty rigorous process, we identified these 5 fellows who have just built the most amazing community of practice and fellowship throughout the last year. Very much under the guidance of Alison and Louise Hickman, who's also working on the Just AI project. And they've done that in very challenging lockdown conditions. I don't think they've ever met in person or been in the same place. And they were also part of something new and have shaped that into something quite incredible, in particular, a community of practice that really supports their areas of inquiry, and for us provides a real model for future fellowships. So I'm really excited to let them speak to you more both about the research they've been doing, but also the models and mechanisms they've used to do that research and to connect and to build a community of practice. So before I hand over to you, I just want to thank you, Sarah, Irene, Yasmine, Caroline, and Erinma, for your hard work and for breaking ground and for showing us what has been possible within the context of this fellowship program. I'm really excited by the radical interpretation of critical humanities that you have developed, and it feels like it really has the potential to inform and shape future practice. I also want to thank AHRC for being so responsive to this idea and giving us the opportunity to support scholars who are rethinking the dominance of science and social sciences in AI ethics discourse, and really supporting the pipeline of early career researchers in the humanities and the arts. So without further ado, we'll kick off and we'll hear from each of the fellows a bit about who you are, about your research, what you've been working on over the fellowship. So I'm going to first hand to Yasmine Boudiaf to kick us off. Yasmine.
Cool. Thank you, Carly. Hello to my fellow fellows, and hi everyone, and thank you for joining us. Apologies, I'm in a shared space and I have to wear a face mask, but I'm reading the captions and I'm going to be careful to just articulate everything that I'm saying. But please do let me know, either in the chat or by waving, if there is anything that you can't comprehend, and I will adjust. So I'm Yasmine Boudiaf, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm in an office in London wearing a face mask, and I have ridiculous orange hair. So I'm a creative technologist and researcher, and I'm interested in producing collective processes of inquiry using tech-based tools. My project for the fellowship is a living document. It's a collaborative platform that invites people of different disciplines to generate knowledge together as a critique of Eurocentric systems of knowledge. And these systems of knowledge have been used as the framework for so-called AI ethics. And I suppose part of my work is challenging the very idea that there can be an AI ethics. So I'm not concerned with outcome so much as process and reflection. I'll be inviting contributions soon. So if anybody is curious, do feel free to reach out, and I will leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Yasmine, and a great call for opportunity for others to be involved. Can you tell us a little more? Can you expand a little more on what you said about challenging whether there can be an AI ethics, and the extent to which by that you mean AI ethics as we've come to understand it, as it's been captured or shaped by white Western culture, or is there an alternative AI ethics, or do you think the entire framing is not useful?
Sure. So for me, there are two things. Firstly, I'm conscious of the fact that we don't have a shared value system to use to construct the framework for a system of ethics, AI or otherwise. The second thing is that the consequences of AI practice, and particularly its effects on marginalized groups, are already here. So we see the harms when it's used in policing, in healthcare, and political attempts at political manipulation. So for many groups, they don't have the luxury to sit and contemplate ethics and speculate. It's more urgent to spend time well, because these groups are already living with the consequences. So it's more urgent and worthwhile to consider forms of justice and to focus on interventions that can bring that about, including the dismantling of the infrastructures that have allowed for such harms to occur in the first place. So that's where I'm at.
That's very helpful, a very clear explanation of what you mean there. Thank you. And I see lots of nods from others, so looking forward to hearing others' thoughts on that. Okay, thank you, Yasmine. We'll come back to you shortly. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Irene Fubara-Manuel, who's going to speak about herself and themselves and their research.
Thank you, Carly. Yeah, my name is Irene. I go by, my pronouns are they, them, in my home office, sitting down in front of my computer, looking at screens. So my project, or actually let's start from my I would say research interest. My research interest sort of starts off with my PhD project, which is sort of looking at biometric technologies and race around the time, and how it is that biometric technologies are used in migration and in the act of, bordering or creating borders or enforcing and policing borders. Around the time that the call came out for the Just AI network, I was reading Design Justice by Sasha Costanza-Chock. And I had come out of finishing up my degree and started thinking about, not just biometric technologies, but technology in general. And so for that reason, the project that I'm working on with Just AI is sort of looking at is looking at technologies that are used in bordering, and with more specific focus on algorithms. And the reason why I would say algorithms instead of AI for now is that we're at the beginning to some extent of it. Even the justifications that a lot of the government give about the technologies that they're using is that they're not that complicated. So that's another issue there. So the project that I'm working on speaks to migrants, people who are, who have applied for this process, and looks at how it is that they have experienced this algorithm. So from a lived experience, and we work from there to sort of ask, I work from there to sort of ask what future do they imagine from that. So I would say to some extent, it builds off of the work of Saidiya Hartman, where she talks about working away from the archives. So what I'm trying to do is work away from the archive of the lived experience into something that is more, I would say, again, because of the responses that I've gotten from the participants, I know that, like Yasmine says, we don't have this shared valued system to work off from, but essentially we're trying to look at what are some steps forward to some extent, and thinking of migration and algorithms. So that's my project in general with Just AI.
Irene, I'm really interested in what you were saying about the kind of definitional questions of when is something an algorithm. And it's something that we go back and forth on at AHRC as well. I remember when we launched Just AI and we had an event and somebody asked Alison, should you be calling it Just AI? Because when you call something AI, you kind of contribute to the hype cycle around it and you make it seem like exceptional, some kind of futuristic technology, when in most cases it's a extension of existing socio-technical systems. I just wondered how you think about the difference, how you think about words and do they matter, and how the migrants you've worked with think about algorithms or have experienced them as algorithms, or is it the case that the people you're speaking to differentiate between an algorithmic system and so kind of does a system of control, an AI system, do you get into that kind of level of detail, and does it matter to the words you use to define what you're talking about there?
I think it was quite interesting, given that prior to, I would say after the workshops that I did, I had a workshop, I would say in collaboration, working with Yasmine, and I came in with the assumption that everybody knows what an algorithm means, and so for that reason, the workshop to some extent had its own problems in itself. So it's quite interesting how much people don't really know too much about it. So what I've been trying to do is work, instead of saying an algorithm, instead it's more looking at the instructions as a closed system of instructions that people are given. But in addition to that, I think in general, what I said, I would say the place that I start from is this metaphor that Sasha Costanza-Chock gives in Design Justice, where they say that the US immigration system essentially to some extent already works as an algorithm, right? So if we should look at something like what it takes, a route, for instance, to get a visa in the UK, for employment, for instance, that is an algorithm, because you are allocating points, you're setting out instructions, you are saying do this and then that happens, if this happens, then that happens. So to some extent, it is an algorithm. So I try not to get stuck on what form it takes, if that makes sense. If it's something that is coded, if it's something that's a narrative. And I think the work that I'm working here, or the way that I've sort of made it accessible to people, is just coming again from their lived experiences, coming from the subjectivities as a way to get a more collective understanding of what's going on, how people are living these so-called algorithms, right? So I would say it's hard to beat the hype because it's everywhere, but I think this is a good place that we are to sort of start informing people, start doing what Simone Brown calls, at least from their work, critical biometric consciousness, start thinking of how we can raise critical, perhaps algorithmic consciousness with the public.
Really, really interesting. There's a comment from Ted Pedersen in the Q&A also on this question of saying he really likes the distinction you make between algorithms and AI. And I think it strikes me while you're talking there that there might be an interesting way to flip that on the kind of power differential on its head there and say, the interesting thing about AI is that people are more willing to talk about ethics when you talk about AI than perhaps they are to talk about ethics when you're talking about just the normal system. So I'm thinking about the algorithm, off-qual algorithm incident last summer, where you had students protesting fuck the algorithm posters and protesting the way in which results had been decided. And we had this big conversation about the ethics of that algorithm, big societal conversation. But actually there's a huge ethical conversation about schooling and education and assessment that predated that and should have equally enraged students, the unfairness of the existing assessment system and how that works. And it's, maybe it's an opportunity in a way I agree with lots of Yasmine's points, but maybe it's an opportunity that people are starting to talk about the ethics of technology. Maybe we need to kind of then retrofit that to talk about the ethics of non-technical systems as well. Like, how do we use that as an entry point to go back then and explore the ethics of the underlying social system, not just the technology that comes on top of it?
Yeah. I think one thing that I'm quite interested to, given that the streaming tool algorithm, which is the starting points to my project, which was, I would say it started in 2015, discontinued as of 2020, but to some extent it's still going on because they're still developing it. And this was, they pretty much discontinued out of litigation that Joint Council for the Welfare for Immigrants did in collaboration with Foxglove. And I would say what I found quite interesting, and this is again one of the reasons why I decided to come to sort of focus on this research project, was that doing my PhD research, I was looking into, older immigration policies, so the movement of West African migrants, Black and brown migrants from, colonial subject to immigrant. And when we start looking at that, you see a problem that has been created, the actual problem of policing the Black and brown migrant. And to some extent, that is what I see a lot with this algorithm. It is, we're looking back to sort of understand what the main problem an algorithm is trying to fix, because to some extent, what an algorithm is supposed to do is fix a problem. And when you go back and look into the genealogy of this algorithm, you can see this larger problem that has been solved, which is to some extent, especially with this one, the problem of policing Black and brown migrants.
Yeah, it's a great example. It really helps to illustrate the problem. Thanks, Irene. I'm going to pass on to Caroline Ward and Erinma Ochu, also known as Squirrel Nation, and ask you to speak a little bit about yourselves and about your project.
Hello, I'm Caroline and I'm a designer researcher.
I'm Erinma. I'm a neuroscientist by background, filmmaker and curator. Together we're Squirrel Nation, and our focus is on coexistence as an ethic. So we often bring together transdisciplinary research to try and imagine different possibilities for living. With this particular project, we had proposed to pre-enact the original 1956 Dartmouth AI study, in which 10 men and other men in America imagined what artificial intelligence could be where it was first conceived. By pre-enactment, we're thinking about how you open up that space. So we kind of step away from Dartmouth in a sense, and our proposition was to have a decolonizing AI reading group and gatherings where we were to work with some of the concepts that would emerge if we were to kind of depart from Dartmouth. Of course, with the pandemic, that's been pretty challenging, but we've done quite a lot of reading that's taken us, our starting point really was Sylvia Wynter's work and her position around the universal standard of man.
Yeah, we hope to kind of bring it all together in a kind of through a kind of ceremonial process. That will be a form of a multimedia piece.
Yeah, and so with Sylvia Wynter's work, she's talking about the universal standard of man, the white, Western, cisgendered, etc., being a way to close off ways of being human otherwise. And so we're interested in how do we open that up to depart the grid that positions us. And to do that, we have to kind of, in a sense, go a little bit beyond what Sylvia Wynter points to this ceremony after humanism, and to look at how we can think about that. And we're starting to explore ways that we would play with that in order to write something which could then become a performance. But it means that we have to find ways to disrupt the stage on which AI was initially imagined, in order to very carefully enable the pluriverse, which exists already, pluriversal knowledge exists already, to be able to come into being and to protect that. So we're thinking around those perspectives.
I think we're probably in agreement with everyone as well around the discourse around AI, and that it acts a very kind of as a mechanism to kind of capture everything. And so when we want to kind of, it requires drilling into it specifically. What do we mean by that? How is it being used? And what forms does it take, actually? Because otherwise, yeah, it's hype and perhaps kind of academic pottery as well. It's kind of very malleable and shape shifts over time. That's kind of why we've gone back to 1956.
Because it's quite a privileged position to be locked in a room, served food, your wives are at home or they're writing up your notes for you. And, you know, the Black law students who were protesting against Dartmouth not admitting Black students are, you know, they're doing those demonstrations. They're not in that room. And so we have to disrupt that, because the stage from which it's imagined, and we, you know, Sarah introduced this to us through Yasinov's work around this view from nowhere and not being situated. So we absolutely have to disrupt that stage. And at the start of our fellowship, quite early on, you know, Temnet Gebri had to depart Google from that stage. You know, she couldn't do AI ethics and racial justice linked to environmental justice from the stage of Google. So that just demonstrates who can get involved in this.
And we're just looking through the concept of citizen identification as well as part of the pre-announcement.
So how power shifts, and how I guess it's a kind of move that we have to take if you're minoritized or marginalized, that you're always having to shape shift around the normalizing force of hegemonic power of, you know, big tech companies, police forces, you know, national borders, and how that encourages us to respond, but actually how do we respond otherwise?
It's really quite a beautiful framing that you're starting from, which, if I've understood correctly, which is really tapping into this conversation about how big tech companies and technology products want us to become more like computers. And the challenge is, how do we become more human? You know, how do we find more humanity in ourselves rather than trying to merge with technology? I'm wondering whether you, I'm sure the answer is yes, but continue to see the same parallels in decision-making in Dartmouth with, you know, decision-making now in Silicon Valley. And do you see any kind of cracks in that? Are there people or companies, dare I say, who you're seeing starting to break open the kind of power of decision-making around technology?
I mean, I guess they'd be doing different things, right? And so for me, it's about, on one level, it's about accountability. And Temnet's paper, which still not been published, MIT published a review of what was in that paper because they saw it, and that was around the power and resource, the energy that it takes to produce and sustain these models for, you know, machine learning models, how much energy goes into that. And that then speaks to marginalized people being impacted because it have environmental impacts. And so, of course, what she's revealed is the whole, almost like the trick of technology that will save us. We've heard this narrative before, you know, and so she's absolutely blown that apart from within Google. They can't publish that paper. And that's the kind of questions we need to ask. I think there is, Yasmine pointed this out to us, there is a list of companies who said, oh, Black Lives Matter, we're going to do all of these things. But what also is behind that? So it's not just about the money, because as Caroline has said before, that the money in terms of technology, it shapes what these things become. So it's, how do these companies do things differently, and who do they, what do they choose to invest in? What does it take us to that we participate this to the extent that we'll get to 4 degrees C, and the global, you know, what we might call in the West the global South, has been completely eradicated by our actions. And you know, so we've got to think about, what is the world that we want? And I can't speak for those companies, to be honest. There's someone at the door.
Just to say that I'm firmly on the side of becoming rather than become. That's quite important distinction.
Great, thank you, Caroline and Erinma. Okay, I'm going to pass on finally to Sarah Chander to talk about her project and the work she's been doing.
Thank you, Carly. Yes, I'm Sarah Chander. I am also a Just AI fellow. I also work in policy in European digital rights, EDRi, as well as having a background of different racial justice work, queer liberation work, and anti-immigration detention activism. I am calling in from Brussels today. I'm wearing glasses. I'm a little bit tired just due to it being the end of the week, but very happy to be here. I can give some background to my project. So my project is the policy sort of version of the Just AI Fellowship. And so really what I have been looking to do is explore what does racial justice actually mean with respect to AI policy, data policy. I have to say that I think my project comes from a space of what I hope to is a form of like productive defensiveness about the term of racial justice. I'm using this term defensiveness because I've been recently reading a book called Black Feminism Reimagined by Jennifer Nash. And in that book, she explores how much academia, particularly looking at the term of intersectionality, much time and energy has been spent defending the true meaning of intersectionality. I feel a little bit like that with the term racial justice. I want to explore what it really means, what sorts of principles and also actions should people, institutions, companies, maybe even be accountable to if they're going to use that term. And here I also want to sort of go back to a project that Yasmine spoke to us about with this system which was tracking all the companies last year, speaking about Black Lives Matter with respect to tech, and how do we form that accountability. I'm saying it's productive defensiveness because essentially what I'm trying to do with that is to set out something useful that I think if organizations really want to commit to speaking about racial justice in the tech policy space, in the AI space, there are a few things that need to be done. We can't just use this term without being accountable to some of these principles. If we do that, we are co-opting what is a really long, rich, contextualized, internationalist, anti-capitalist concept, which is racial justice. And we can't take that out of context. So in that sense, what my project will do is actually set out a list of some of these principles, and that's been very much sort of informed by my own experience, by the conversations with the other fellows, by interviews with racial justice activists here in the UK in a very contextual space, but also people that are working at the intersection between racial justice and ethics, and AI ethics, and that is just quite a few people, but they do exist here. Coming up with those principles, but also in a few case studies, trying to set out how does that apply with respect to AI policy. How does that fit into the AI ethics conversation? I do want to plus one to what Yasmine and also everyone has said about AI ethics. I think some of the conclusions of what I will be talking about do very much question how useful AI ethics is. And I really like the idea of exploring like AI ethics as a luxury concept, perhaps in some ways oppositional to justice. And in that way also think about in the anti-capitalist sort of interpretation of what racial justice means, picking up on Mustafa's point in the chat, is also exposing really the role of academia, but also the largest tech companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, in really shaping and mobilizing the term AI ethics in a way that is actually oppositional to what real justice would mean if we were to really think about justice in a context of AI and tech policy. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sarah. And for those who didn't see, Yasmine put the tracker in the chat that Sarah and others have referred to, which is a fascinating scroll down. I haven't seen this before, but it's essentially a list of 220 tech companies that made statements, I assume in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter movement last summer, about racial justice. And then this is, sorry, just to clarify, this is something that you guys have prepared, or this is something that somebody else has put together? No. Additional external resource. So
the person who made it and their details are on the document.
Thank you. You're right. Of course, it does say who has created it. But yeah, really incredible way of interrogating these issues. Sarah, I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to the co-option of racial justice as a term, and just give your perspective of somebody who's a policy professional in Brussels. How do you see, I'm not speaking from expertise here, I understand that Europe has a different relationship with racial justice and racism than the UK and the US, again, of course. But how do you see racial justice being used in policy domains and potentially co-opted in policy domains in Europe or at the European Union level?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that racial justice isn't used in, I think, any policy conversation that at least that I've been a part of. And I think myself and my colleagues, we do our best, but I won't say that, I can't say that there has been an uptake of what racial justice means in the context of AI policy, whether it be in the UK or in the EU context. I think maybe one way that I can maybe make that concrete and elaborate on what that looks like is this conversation about abolition of technologies, red lines on technologies. For me, I think this is the most concrete way we can speak about how racial justice might apply in practice to AI policy. And that is a conversation that's relevant at the EU level. It's also a conversation that maybe is a little bit less relevant at the UK level, because there's less of a willingness of activists to take it there. What I mean by this, also coming back to the point already raised about the sort of like death maybe of AI ethics, is something Safiya Noble said at RightsCon recently. She said, we are past this desire for ethical AI. Instead, some of the technologies should be outright abolished, and there needs to be repair and restoration for harms. For me, this is a really concrete way that we can talk about racial justice in practice, in policy. So when we're talking about the conversation on predictive policing, the use of military grade drones at the border, EU's border, facial recognition, obviously, we're seeing a conversation which is primarily about how do we make these technologies better? How do we eliminate bias and make the technologies better? Julia Powell's comments on this really nicely when she says that those types of conversation, what they're actually doing is finding a way to perfect instruments of surveillance. I think a racial justice approach to that would be opening up this conversation on abolition of technologies that we know, even if we were to improve their accuracy, even if we were to go through this process of technical debiasing, what we would never be able to do is reduce the extent to which such systems exacerbate structural inequality and oppression. At the EU level, at least, it's relevant to some extent because we're having that conversation about bans. And what we're trying to do is bring in people with experience of over-policing, of racial profiling, of having their data extracted from them at the border. What we're trying to do is bring these people to the table, to the policymaking conversation. But I think what we will have seen is a grand resistance to that process of inclusive policymaking, of participation, not just by the policymakers themselves, but also the people that are used to holding power in those spaces. The conversation on AI ethics has been a ring-fenced, like what I call is like technical gatekeeping exercise, where essentially what we've seen is social conversations have been co-opted by people with some expertise in how tech works. And I feel we've seen some resistance there into the inclusion of actually having a more structural conversation, which would include conversations about abolishing certain technologies, but also conversations about what should be there in their place.
It makes me wonder, from the perspective of a provocateur, sometimes what you hear, well, sometimes you hear it quite often these days, I would say, which is that technologies like algorithms and AI can help us, well, first of all, they can help us see biases which were previously, obfuscated. And secondly, they can be less biased than humans. And I wondered how you think about those kinds of arguments. I'd love to give you a chance to explain why that's wrong. And I also wondered on the abolitionist approach to some of these technologies, is it the case that from a perspective of racial justice, some of them, there's no kind of racial, there's no benefit to marginalized groups or historically marginalized groups to any of these technologies? Can do you buy into the arguments around technology rebalancing power? I suppose that's open to everyone. Yeah, Yasmine, do you want to go first?
Yeah, just to say that it's not that clear cut. So I'll give you an example. In France, recently, there was legislation brought in that you can't film police officers. And, whilst there's a great deal of effort to reduce the amount of surveillance in general or abolish it altogether, there are human rights groups, and in particular migrant rights groups, who are advocating for more surveillance in order that it can be evidence that there is, racial violence going on. So it's really not that simple, and it's not so much about the technology itself, but it's about the infrastructures that allow it to be used in a way that could be harmful.
I think I'd like to speak to that as well. With the conversations that I had with my participants, it was quite interesting. I would say the conversations where there was a lot of tension around that, especially given that, as a person who is most likely Nigerian, the way that you prove that you are a legal migrant, legal in quotes, is that you provide further documentation, right? So to some extent, a lot of the discussions that people have are about how can I reduce this documentation? And in other ways, it means for this, more technologically advanced ways of surveillance. So I can understand why there's that tension with the migrant rights activism groups too, because you can see that when someone has been told that you have been delegitimized, you have been sort of tagged to some extent as a criminal, then what is the best way to prove that you are not one is through documentation that you have not done anything wrong. So to some extent, it now technology becomes part of that performance of legality, right? So I fall back to what Yasmine is saying, that it's not necessarily the issue of the technology itself, but the systems, the infrastructure behind the technologies. Because to some extent, I understand why people would say, yes, documentation matters. Yes, documentation is important, but at the end of the day, why are we documenting in the first place? Why is it that you have been asked to provide 10,000 pages of your life? And it's not because this system wants you to prove yourself. It's that this system doesn't want you to be in it. So it's the premise that has been created to some extent is that you are not wanted. So you have to sort of force your way in to some extent. So I can understand why people are saying that, but at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about how do we make, so the conversation that you have, that I've been seeing in my few years of reading to some extent, following the UK visa immigration services and the bordering of the entire bordering, is that there's this push for digital transformation as a way to reduce the documentation, but the push for digital transformation is further surveillance. Instead of asking, why do we need to surveil in the first place? Why must there be documentation that would sort of, that would be needed to some extent? Because again, people can travel without having to pile up documentation, right? So it asks that we sort of look at the bigger system of what bordering does, why we need to create documents in the first place. So in that terms, I would say one thing too that I've been thinking about, and I think Mustafa has raised it up to some extent in the chats, is about carceral technology, right? So to some extent, if we're thinking about technology and we look at the context in which it was developed, immediately we start seeing signs of carceral society. We should immediately go for what not Yasmine, Sarah was saying, we should start thinking of abolition, right?
But it also reminds me another point that Mustafa made in the Q&A, which is, he said, I endorse Sophia Noble's call, but how to implement given the coloniality of law, which reminds me a little bit about what you're just saying there on documentation, which is the alternative to submitting to the system also requires submitting to a system, which, the legal system itself equally colonized, I suppose, is the point that he was making. I think there's lots of people in the discussion and the Q&A that really resonate with I think the theme that's running through lots of your interventions about the need to dispense with, the kind of co-option of AI ethics and the need to dispense with it and look for alternatives. One person asks whether, and this person says they work in tech, but they're not an ethics expert. Should we think about rebranding ethics in AI as a power in AI discussion? This person says, I find it easier to convey urgency and have a discussion with a broader audience. Is that something that you all think is useful? And another kind of link to that, another question about, alternatives to the status quo. One way to think about them is abolition. Another person has suggested that it's about slowing down innovation to enable consideration of different issues, I suppose. So Woody Bayless commented, in the past, we created tools and did not understand their impact. For example, we're just starting to deal with the culture developed by the Industrial Revolution, but because we were ignorant of impact, that allowed for extremely fast innovation. So I suppose the question there is the should we think about rebranding ethics as being more about power? Most of you have talked about justice instead of ethics. So I wonder what your thoughts are on power. And secondly, is there some value in the ethics process at all if it slows down innovation? Or is it harmful to or counterproductive to use it all from your perspective? Caroline and Erinma, I saw you typing in the chat. Do you want to come in?
Yes, I would agree that maybe the term ethics could be replaced with justice in this perspective. But also, I think there's still kind of conversations that we had around ethics as well. Obviously, the power at play, and often the power that's in play with AI or whatever AI might be, tends to be one that's political rather than one that's around potential or potentia, to draw from Spinoza. So what I'm trying to say here is, the way that these technologies tend to be deployed tend to be one that's around governmentality, and often reproduce the act of necropolitics on an everyday basis. And so all of these systems and structures that we all live in are kind of a force that are not really realizing people's potential as such, but kind of, as Irene says, there's a way to keep us all out in a way. So, I guess, can we reimagine? The reason why we're in the reimagine space is because we don't think it's enough to really just try and tweak them, because even if we try and, I suppose, as Sarah said, de-bias these systems, it's still a bit of a black box as to if we make them more readily applicable to everyone, what is that also feeding into, because there's a whole private sector behind these industries as well, and they're all very well connected. And we don't really know what we're co-opting. Instead, could the idea of AI and justice be indexed in a form of care instead?
Yeah, and I mean, to go back to the point about the tech companies and what might they do, we have values, we have choices. We could be working on assistive technologies. We could be hiring disabled people to be designers, designing those assistive technologies with the lived experience of living with specific disabilities. If I had the money and the resource to set up a lab, that's what I'd be wanting to do, and so we have to question what we choose to put our money into, our resources into, and our energy behind. And the way in which we now feel the world, it's sensed differently from different perspectives. And with the climate crisis that's here already, with the coronavirus, which is controlling us, and we have to collaborate with it and find different ways out of this mess. The CARE Act that was dismantled, the horrific Sewell report that was written to allow people to do more harm to Black people in Britain, all these kind of excuses. We have to really question, what is it to be a human being, or to become? What do we want to become as a species, or beyond being a species? Because that question is rapidly having to be asked. It's been asked of many of us for centuries, to be honest. And stories came before imperial science and how we understand the world. So I think we've got really hard questions to ask ourselves about what do we want to be doing going forward. And if you're in charge of an institution, you have power to change that in terms of your choices. So, I've just handed back some of my research funding for it to be invested in the communities that were the ones that absolutely stayed connected to me during this period when no one else did. And that's pure solidarity, So I think we have got choices, and we need to. The challenge with technology and with AI as currently imagined is that it's creating an excuse to push our choices away from us. Oh, we couldn't do anything about that, Erinma. Sorry, your contract's run out. We can't do anything about that. if you're in charge, you can do what you like. So it's how do you take on those leadership perspectives and make different choices and actually own those choices, because these technologies are an excuse to not be accountable to ourselves. And that's a really weird position to be in, I think.
A great point. It touches really well on a good question in the chat from Arik Chowdhury, which I'll read in full. So he says, what consideration have panelists given to the role of ideology in tech policy conversations? The most successful racial justice initiatives throughout history have come from a distinctly socialist perspective or have been rooted in anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. Very few meaningful or significant anti-racism movements, if any, have been rooted in a belief in capitalism or neoliberalism. Are you seeing enough of this ideological diversity in your respective fields or workplaces? Big question. Sarah, you touched a little bit about the anti-capitalist aspect of racial justice movement. Did you want to try to answer that question from Arik?
Yeah, it's a great question. Hi, Arik. So yeah, it can be very simply answered. No, that diversity isn't there. Again, going back to Mustafa's point before, which is that much of the AI ethics field is premised and is premised on some notions of the inherent benefits of technology, and also inherently linked to big tech companies, right? If you look at some of the biggest think tanks in the US that work on AI ethics, to some extent even have quite a critical, what you might say is on the face of it, a critical perspective on the disproportionate impact of technology on racialized or other marginalized people. They're all funded by big technology companies. So then I think we come to the question that was about slowness, like would slowing down actually help? No, it wouldn't, because it essentially, the pace is slightly irrelevant, right? As Erinma said, with COVID, we've seen a slowing and a simultaneous speeding up of the way things work. But when it comes to the centralization of the power of big tech, what was used by this changes in pace in whatever direction were just different ways to embed dominance. So the pace isn't the question, it's about the dominance is the question, and how do you undo that centralization of power? So then when we come to the question of like, do we have enough like ideological diversity? And by that, I take to mean, do we have enough anti-capitalist and socialist visions in our conversations about AI? The question is definitely not, because the field is not, going back to Yasmine's brilliant first point, we don't have a combined uniform, maybe not uniform, but like we don't have a shared ethic about what AI ethics is or what justice means in that context. And anti-capitalism isn't part of that conversation, mainly because also many people benefit from the capitalist like mode of production in the form of technology. Many people that work in a space, they get their paycheck from that very system. So I hope that answers the question.
Yasmine, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I think, yeah, well, just, I totally like agree with what Sarah just said, and just to say that it is a genuine conundrum, but equally, I think to Syed Mustafa Ali's point, let's not fall into the trap of tech solutionism or solutionism full stop and think that oh yeah, you know, there's a simple fix, and, you know, with a project or with an intervention, we can sort this out. So I'd like to maybe offer a way of looking at it that is perhaps a bit more playful and offer a kind of route into a more optimistic kind of slowly kind of a process rather than outcome. So I'd like to just reference one brilliant meme that I really, really love. And I'll try to be as expressive with like my eyes as I possibly can and my hands, because I realize that, you know, there's so much that, you know, we're not kind of expressing, or at least I'm not expressing, but I'll do my best. So the meme is a picture of a dog, and there's a person's hand petting it with the caption, whether or not you are a good boy depends on what system of ethics I choose to apply. And fundamentally, that's what we're trying to like dismantle and work against, because of our experiences working and existing within infrastructures where certain epistemologies are never adequate or considered, you know, worthy of becoming, for example, policy. But I'm optimistic, and I think part of the brilliant initiative that is Just AI, and it's also kudos to Alison Powell's vision of, you know, process, emphasizing process rather than just outcome, is that, you know, we do create these spaces together to try to really grapple with the hard questions. And, you know, we're doing it. So in answer to your questions, like you participating, coming into this space, engaging with our projects, you know, this is all part of what we are describing as kind of steps towards not necessarily solutions, but really like for interventions, right? And interventions, to me, don't necessarily have to be active. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, policy craft. I think there is a lot to learn from, you know, crypt technoscience and a lot of what Louise Hickman has been working on with refusal, and other practitioners around things like rest as intervention. Yeah, so I don't know, I've kind of lost my track of thought.
No, but it's a really good segue actually into talking a little more about how you all have worked over the past year. And you've just alluded to that a bit, Yasmine, about creating spaces and processes for working towards interventions, if not solutions. One of the amazing innovations of this fellowship has been the community practice and the kind of method and methodology of working together. And I wondered, I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about that, all of you. I might start with Sarah, if that's okay, to tell us a little bit about the community of practice and the community agreement that you all put together and how it's shaped your work. And as you start talking, I will post the community agreement in the chat for others to look at and learn from.
So the community agreement was really our collective attempt to sort of, again, coming back to this question of values, set out what we thought those agreed values could be, build the space, articulate what we would commit to in that space. And by space, I mean the labs. So primarily our interaction has been through labs, which would be fortnightly conversations between us where we interrogate conversations around racial justice, AI, situated knowledge, like Black feminism, like all kinds of like thought that would be relevant to our projects, and explore together how that was coming up. But in order to be able to get to that content and to be able to actually discuss properly what we're like, the forms of dominance we're trying to speak about, we needed to recognize them and at least set out between us how we wanted that to unfold in the space. I have to say first, before I explain a little bit about the community practice, I'd have to say first of all that the fellows, and particularly like all of the fellows, had done a lot of work to put that together collectively and to write that. So just to say that, but also to say that in the lab process, more broadly, Louise Hickman has really been a foundational to our process. One of the most reflective and caring presences that we could have hoped for in this fellows process, to be able to actually achieve what we wanted to achieve, being completely so beautifully aware of our needs, but also the underlying power structures that we were talking about. And I think I have to say before is that, like, I think it would have been a very different process without her there and her labor that she put into it. So the community of practice, you can read it. I won't speak to everything, but in essence, that was our exercise of how can we foreground situated knowledge and what are the principles that need to determine that. I will also add that part of why we realized we need this was because the space wasn't always only just between us and Louise, but it was also others coming into the space, visitors coming into the space. And so we wanted to really set the terms of how those interactions would go. I won't articulate all of the commitments that we make in that, but I wanted to point out a few. So the first is the notion of access as practice. We really drew a lot from principles of disability justice, how we could actually bring some of those principles into life. We had to think about the process of using closed captions, the process of actually being aware of sort of different notions of how to embed disability justice into the space, not as an afterthought, but actually as foundational to that concept. And I think that that's really relevant to many of us building sort of online spaces and conversations, is that often those considerations are an add-on and not really part of the core of the methodology of most conversations. Also that another principle that we really thought about is this notion of not having in our space to question structural oppression. This came up before in the conversation, the concept of AI helping us document and like helping us expose discrimination and bias. Instead, in that space, we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to be sort of obfuscated by a conversation of, does racism exist? Does ableism exist? How can we prove it? But rather take that as a fact and go from there. And so we were very explicit that we not only wouldn't have a space where we have sort of like abusive language, but we also wouldn't call into question empirically the forms of oppression that we're talking about, because of how sort of stunting that could be to our conversation. And then the last thing was that really drawing on the importance of crediting and respecting the work of the fellows. Like a lot of conversations in terms of knowledge production of how racialized people, Black people, other people of color are sort of how they experience spaces of knowledge production is always frequently that of extraction. Taking ideas and delegitimizing our ideas, and really a lot of that is got us to this place of underrepresentation, as you mentioned, Carly, at the start. So we wanted to reverse that and make it very, very explicit that anything that comes out of the lab should be respected and credited, and we commit to do so for others' work, and that we acknowledge this process of citational politics also. I haven't explained all of them, but people can read the rest, and maybe some of the other fellows have something to say about this community of practice and our joint process.
Yeah, Erinma.
Yeah, so for me, basically, it was really wonderful that Louise had brought this way, like the first meeting was so beautifully orchestrated in how we negotiate, how we were going to work together. It was just stunning. I've worked with a lot of facilitators, I've hired facilitators, I've seen people facilitate things, and it was just, you know, we're talking about how do you build a foundation on which we can authentically be ourselves, and Louise created that space for us, and then we managed to hold it, which was fantastic. And then there's always the challenge that the institutions that give you the money, they want to come in and see what you're doing. They want to come in and they want to know, what have you learned? They want to come in, good timing, Caroline. They want to come in and they want to find out what have you been up to? And in that moment, it's this opening up of something you've built that could be really actually quite violent. And we've just seen, as I said before, some people had been thrown aside from big stages in which they were trying to do this kind of work. And so that moment was when we have to think, how do we protect this in words? Who gets to write the future? We've written a blog post on this with Sarah. And that requires us to, you know, tools and technology, pen and pencil, pen and paper, thoughts. We had to put something down to protect what we'd created for others coming in. And in some ways, this kind of spoke to a little bit, you know, the negotiations of power that will come, where people don't even, someone said in the chat, people don't realize what they're doing. I have to push back on that. They do. People test power on Black people all of the time, whatever opportunity they get. People test their power on disabled people all of the time, whenever they get the chance. And we have to work very, very hard to push back on it. It produces more labor. And we really didn't want to have that labor in our time together. But we did really want to engage with the external advisory folk who'd been involved in picking us. So it was a structure that would enable us to continue to be ourselves, to be open to other people, and to set the vibe of that space and the energy of it. We're just talking about the community agreement. So yeah, but also to say, you know, with this, Stuart Hall, he talks about this, there doesn't have to be this permanent hegemony. You can choose not to have it, right? So our community agreement is a way to not have it in our space between us. And it means that we can destabilize those historical imperialistic ways of experiencing the world, and we don't have to have it in our lives. So we hope people will have a look at it, think about building on it. It has to be built from a minoritized perspective.
I wondered, Irene, from your perspective, in contrast, how do you contrast academic communities or the kind of standard approaches you see in academic communities with this type of community approach? How does it differ from what you see, you know, in your exposure to universities and academic communities?
Firstly, I'm the wrong kind of academic to ask that question. Because I work in that academic community, right? So the academic community that I'm from, my disciplines have been, you know, at least the ones that I've chosen are gender studies and then media studies. Mm-hmm. So I remember through our community agreements, I think that was something that I did a lot actually during my undergrad years, where professors would sit down and set safe space guidelines for people to engage in class, because again, it's hard when you're dealing with people who have lived experiences of violence and people who are coming in to learn about something that feel like simply because there's that academic debate that I should be able to debate your oppression. So definitely not. I think that's, again, it's something that I've seen in a lot of the academic communities that I've seen, and I would like it to keep going on, because I see that need for academic objectivity and that sort of need to debate people's oppression as something that doesn't need to exist at all in academia, but it really depends on how people have started it, of how the lecturers, the facilitators have started it off. So there isn't that.
No, but that's really good to hear, actually, that it's more commonplace in certain disciplines like the ones that you're affiliated with.
I would say it's more commonplace with specific tutors and specific people who have embedded decolonial values into their pedagogy.
Right. It seems like a really worthwhile innovation, and I have to admit it's not an approach that I had come across prior to this. And thank you to you all, and to Louise, of course, for spearheading it as a kind of novel way of thinking about collaborative communities. Please go ahead.
It's not new.
Well, sorry. I mean, new to me, I suppose, but
it's not new.
Yeah.
And this is the challenge with academia, right? The world of discovery is over. Era of discovery is over. We're into an era in which things will just be sensed differently. Discovery era is over. There's nothing new.
Yeah. What do you take away from this experience in terms of opportunities for creating in terms of creating opportunities for others to do this research, and other voices like yourselves to gain space and recognition for their work? What can organizations like ours do more of? What would you like to see UKRI or other institutions be doing more of, other funders, for example? How do we create more opportunities for thinkers and researchers like yourselves to do this work? Does anyone have any bright ideas or calls to arm? Yasmine?
Well, I would like to perhaps give some examples of what, as Erinma said, this is not the first ever community agreement or the first attempt at making such spaces. So I will give maybe a couple of examples of, at least from my practice in creative tech, where projects or attempts at creating these sorts of communities, I feel, are really exciting, and I wish that there was more attention from funders to really recognise the value of that. And just to say that the community agreement is the first iteration, and we're creating a space with massive ambitions. So if there are institutions or funders, just get in touch. If you mean what you say about equity, justice, trying to, or as Carly, as you mentioned earlier, trying to create entry points to topics from people who are perhaps outside of academia or outside of tech or outside of ethics or outside of policy to engage, then this is perhaps how you could. So Irene earlier mentioned the work of Sasha Costanza-Top and their thoughtful kind of process of design justice. There's a group in the UK called the Institute for Technology in the Public Interest that do critiques on policy. Like recently they did a sort of bug report, which is a process used in tech to critique kind of new bits of software and they've invited people who aren't necessarily techies through that process to engage with policy. I also run a series of workshops on entanglements, where I bring forward government contracts, one of which recently showed a particular company winning a contract just for £1. You don't need to be a lawyer or a contract lawyer to see how absurd that is. But it's about opening it up for participation and creating those sorts of spaces for engagement. There's also forensic architecture. They produce, a bunch of tech interventions to really interrogate injustice. No Tech for Tyrants do excellent grassroots activism. So there's a whole host of para-academic, independent researchers, creative researchers that are already engaged. But part of our work is creating those spaces to bring them together, rather than what I feel traditional academia is, which tries to bend that messaging and the language and the thinking in order to fulfill funders' idea of what good work is. So yeah, that's part of. But we're already doing the work. Lots of people are already doing the work, and the onus should be on institutions to come and meet us where we are. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Yasmine. Irene?
I think for me, as a person whose entire story is migration, right? So I've come in from Nigeria into Canada, into the UK, and the only way that I've been able to sort of gain access to all this knowledge, all this, institutional, to some extent, validation is through education, is through migration, and it's through sort of feeding the system to some extent. What I would say is that I think it's quite important that we think of how it is that we're bringing people in along with us. And Yasmine has already touched on that through their workshops with public education, but I think it's quite important. I think it's even more urgent to some extent with people from the global South, because these conversations we are having, look at the way that, Twitter is sort of running amok right now in Nigeria. It's ridiculous to have these conversations and not see how it is that they're affecting people, how it is that these things that we're sort of, the demise of democracy through technology, right? How does that affect people in the global South? So to me, I think a lot of the work that's done around research as well, and there needs to be a lot of, people who are sort of funded, who are supported, who are coming in from the global South again, so that we can have these conversations that, that are quite important for radical change and bring people along with us, so that people from the global South are not constantly playing catch up with the rest of us. So yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Irene. Did anyone have anything else to say on that point?
They're just kind of linked to that, but there was a question in the chat about vaccines. Vaccines and the technology from which they've been imagined, again, it's private industry, but it's using public money to make those technologies. So some in the chat, someone's talking about refusal and people not wanting to take the vaccine. That's a really dangerous conversation to go down by saying, Black communities are refusing the vaccine. Actually, we have to go back and look to see who was left out of the Chancellor's package to support people to shield from that vaccine. And maybe we might have different responses to vaccination, but also the profits from those vaccines don't go back into the public purse. Again, it goes back to choices and values of companies and the technologies that we choose to produce. And then if we look what's happening now in Africa and India, and not being able to access the vaccine, it's just, this is part of imperialism. And so we can't have that conversation around abolition and refusal linked to vaccination without looking at the ideology behind what invented those of that and that position.
Also just say that refusal, it has a price. It's not an easy path to take, but it might be that we can hold on to our integrity. That's kind of what's at stake.
And it's also a thing about being co-opted into what it means to become human. So we're going down a path very rapidly with globalization, which has brought about coronavirus and humans being in contact with these different species that then release them into the environment, and we're flying all over the world. We have to look at that responsibility. That those are choices that we have made. Again, particularly from where we're situated, we have to think about those choices and their impacts on the rest of the world, as well as locally. We can't ignore it and pretend that Black people are putting themselves in a trap, because we put them in that trap. In Britain, every single person has benefited from slavery. We absolutely have. Every single person has contributed to the climate crisis. So we just have to think about, it requires us to think about these historical conjectures and what brought us to this moment, and how do we want to go forward in an affirmative way. And that's not blaming minorities for not taking vaccines.
Yeah, very enthusiastic agreement by Yasmine there as well. And an interesting way to tie up some threads, I think, that have cut through this conversation around globalization, capitalism, racial justice, but also climate justice, which it strikes me kind of rest on similar ideologies. We need to wrap up. I want to ask you all one more question, which is, who should we be reading? I've heard design justice mentioned a few times. Jasanoff mentioned. Are there others that you're really enjoying at the moment, finding instrumental in this work that you're doing? And do you want to share? Sarah, any suggestions?
So many.
You don't. I won't define you by your choice. So just choose one at random.
I'm going to quickly say a few. So I would say a lot of the conversation on racial justice is very dominated by US conversations, which is also part of US hegemony and other hegemony. So I would say let's read into the histories of Black and brown anti-racist struggle in the UK, because that's where we're all working. Well, most of us working, maybe not me. So yeah, we'll read Paul Gilroy, read Sivanandan, read the work of Claudia Jones, read people that have sort of set our history of struggle of Black and brown people here. I also want to say, on the point of infrastructures, people should read Seda Gurses, who is one of the people that have really informed my work about how we can't have a conversation about bias. We have to have a conversation about racial justice and infrastructures. And then lastly, read all of my fellows, because I really think that they're shaping a space that is really burgeoning and important. So yeah, that's my
wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Squirrel Nation.
We've also been reading, obviously, Benjamin, Artificial Whiteness as well has been really informative. This Science, Catherine McKenna, who's also a bit of an expert on Sylvia Winter, and also the Undercommons, Fred Morton and Stefano Harney, and Ted Chang, actually, for just for a lot of an alternative way into AI.
I'd just add it is worth looking at Ruth Gilmore's definition of racism. Racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. I think people need to look at that. A lot of people tell me, oh, racism doesn't exist. Statistics tell us otherwise.
Design for the Pluriverse by Arthur Escobar. That takes more of a decolonizing approach.
Wonderful, thank you. If you're able to put your types and recommendations in the chat, it looks like some of the audience would appreciate that, but we can also follow up. Irene.
Sorry, I had to mute myself. I would sort of stick with what Sarah said there and not necessarily recommend readings, but sort of focus more on the UK. I would say one of the people whose work has been pivotal to my understanding of UK surveillance of Blackness, for instance, is a person who's now a professor and also a person from the Black arts history, Black arts movement called Keith Piper. He also wrote on digital. He also did work on digital diasporas as well. And Keith Piper's work for me as a practitioner is quite interesting for the fact that in the 90s too, he talks about the ways that, you know, the inclusion of the UK into the EU and how that sort of excludes people and how technology sort of links into that, but he's doing this through art practice. So I'm not telling you to read, I'm telling you to experience people's art. So experience Keith Piper's work, go out there and look at the works from, you know, the Black archives, go out there and look at work from, you know, what's the other name? From Autograph as well. Go out there and look at, for instance, the art of Zanele Muholi also talks about, you know, sexuality, racial justice, because in as much as, you know, in as much as technology matters, production also matters, because I think production is how it is that we are able to intervene. So go out there and experience Black artists.
Wonderful, thank you, Irene, great prompt. And Yasmine, last but not least.
I suppose just one book that I've been reading and rereading is just kind of addresses like something that's quite fundamental to me, which is Epistemic Injustice, The Power and Ethics of Knowing by Miranda Fricker. And also just to say that do like keep in touch and keep a lookout for our work, because we'll also be publishing something together quite soon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today and for a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. We are over time, but we have had a good proportion of people stick with us, which is always a good endorsement of an interesting conversation. So thank you all to the audience for hanging around. And I think everyone is very interested in particular in your recommendations. If I can just quickly thank, in addition to the fellows, the advisory group and others who have mentored and added advice to the fellows over the past year. That includes Mustafa Ali, who was here today, Francesca Sabande, Sanjay Sharma, Brittany Smith, Mitali Nkonde, and Thompson Chengeta. We're really grateful to their time as well. We will let you all go. We have a final event tomorrow, which Hannah has posted in the chat if you want more information. And otherwise, do stay and follow the work of all of these interesting people. There'll be much more to come, I'm sure. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you. Take care.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks.